Chapter 9.
And 10.
Kyle walked around the front of the garage and saw Dan coming out of the office. I'm ready to go, Kyle said. Dan nodded and said, okay, go to the office and punch in. Then I need you to pull the transmission on the Plymouth. You can do that? Sure, Kyle said. And I can drop the new one in. We'll have it this morning, Dan said. Look, Kyle said before Dan could turn and head for the garage, I want to thank you for letting us use the room in the back and for breakfast. My friends and I really appreciate it. Dan just looked at him and nodded. You and your friends can stay there as long as everybody behaves themselves and you don't wreck the place. Then without another word, Dan turned and headed for the garage. Kyle walked around to the office and found it occupied. The girl behind the desk smiled and said, Hi, my name is Dawn. For a second, Kyle was too surprised to respond. He had expected the office to be empty. You must be Kyle, she said, holding out her hand. Kyle shook it and smiled. Nice to meet you, Dawn. It was nice to meet her. Kyle guessed she was about his age, maybe a little older. She was definitely pretty. She had shoulder-length blonde hair that curled at the ends. She also had a nice smile. And she smelled great. Suddenly, Kyle was keenly aware of how long it had been since he had last had a date. Here, she said, holding out a time card with his name printed out in a neat female handwriting. Definitely way too long, Kyle thought. And Buddha's middle way teaches us to avoid extreme forms of self-denial. Kyle decided that a week or two in Stonewall wouldn't be so bad after all. Taking the time card, he ran it under the clock, which stamped it with the time. Then he put it on a rack on the wall, a rack that held a time card for Dawn and another for Gomer. Have you been working for Dan long? Kyle asked. Dawn shook her head and said, No, I'm just part-time. I'm getting his office in order. She gestured to the computer on the desk in front of her and said, I'm also trying to get Dan set up on the internet. He rebuilds radios on old cars, but he's hopeless on the computer and needs a website. She tutted gently and said, Sorry to say that I'm not much better. Well, maybe I could help, Kyle said. Actually, he wasn't sure that he could. He was okay on the computer, but he didn't know much about internet programming. Too late, though. He'd already offered. Maybe Liz could talk him through a few things, and it would help him get to know Dawn a little better. Can I help you? A stern voice said behind Kyle. Turning, he saw Gomer standing in the doorway. What? Kyle said. What do you need, partner? Gomer said. He looked bigger than Kyle had remembered from yesterday, or was it just that Kyle was closer to him today? In any case, there was no mistaking the menace in his voice. Is this guy bothering you, Dawn? Gomer said. Just calm down, Gomer, Dawn said. This is Kyle. He's working for Dan. Kyle mustered a friendly smile and said, Hi, I'm Kyle. You towed our van yesterday. Then Kyle could see that Gomer recognized him. However, his sour expression didn't get any friendlier. Kyle held out his hand. Gomer ignored him and spoke to Dawn. I've got the tranny. Any tow calls? No, Dawn said, but Dan might need you to go to Pueblo for some parts. You can talk to him? Gomer shot Kyle a dirty look and headed out the door. Well, Kyle said. Oh, don't mind Gomer, Dawn said. Are you two? Kyle asked. Dawn shook her head and said, No, but he acts like it sometimes. Then she smiled that smile at him. I'm happy to say that I'm a free agent. Okay then, Kyle said, I better get to work. See you later, Kyle, Dawn said as he left the office. Dan and Gomer were talking when Kyle came into the shop area. Kyle grabbed the lift from out back and pulled the transmission out of the pickup, Dan said. Gomer will give you a hand with it. Kyle headed across the shop floor to the back door. Outside, he saw more junked cars in the Volkswagen van that Gomer had mentioned the day before. The van was in bad shape. One look told Kyle it would probably never run again. The back was smashed in pretty well, and it just wouldn't pay to do the extensive bodywork on a car that old. It also was rusted out along the bottom. The most remarkable thing about the van was the classic 60s hippie paint job. Psychedelic colors swirling around, large peace signs painted on the front and the driver's side. Clearly the work had been done by hand, but someone had done a pretty good job. The colors were faded and mixed with a good deal of rust, but Kyle found it easy to imagine how the van must have looked years ago. What he couldn't imagine was Dan driving it, ever. Aside from the long hair and a ponytail, Dan looked like an average, slightly grouchy, middle-aged guy. Kyle wanted to get to work, but he figured he had time for a quick check under the hood. It took him some doing to get the hood open, but he saw the engine was pretty much intact. Then he saw the crack in the engine block. That was it. The engine would never start again. However, that didn't mean the timing chain wouldn't still be good, but he would have to take the engine apart to be sure. He would have to remember to talk to Dan about that later. Now he had work to do. The transmission lift was a platform on wheels that had two U-shaped cradles that held the front and the back of a transmission. Because transmissions are roughly cone-shaped, one of the cradles was larger than the other. Grabbing the lift, Kyle wheeled it around to the front of the garage where Gomer waited by an old pickup that was marked Johnny's Garage. In the back of the pickup, Kyle could see the transmission. He lowered the tailgate on the truck and raised the lift into place using the crank on the side. Later, he would lower it and use the lift to set the transmission into place under the car. Leaning into the pickup, he said to Gomer, "Would you give me a hand with this?" Gomer lit a cigarette and looked past Kyle down the road. "Gomer," Kyle said. The older man didn't even look in his direction. "Would you give me a hand with this, please?" Kyle said. When Gomer continued to ignore him, Kyle raised his voice and said, "Hey, Gomer." Gomer finally looked his way and said coolly, "I figure that you are such a hot mechanic that you don't need help." Then Gomer took a drag off his cigarette and blew the smoke in Kyle's direction. "You got a problem with that?" His voice was even, but Kyle could hear the menace there just the same. In his football days, Kyle would not have hesitated to meet the challenge, even though Gomer had had a good 6 inches and 30 pounds on him. And he more than likely would have given Gomer a surprise. But that was before he had found out the truth about Max and the others, before he had found Buddha. Kyle felt blood rushing to his face and forced himself to keep steady. "What do you say, Mr. Mechanic?" Gomer said, throwing his cigarette down and holding his hands out. Maybe it's time to put Buddha on hold, Kyle thought, clenching his own fists. And he might have used them too, but he remembered his friends. The last thing they all needed was the added attention that a fight would bring, even if Kyle won. Still, the urge to knock that smirk off Gomer's face was strong. Kyle forced a smile of his own and said, "Sorry, maybe another time. I've got work to do." Kyle caught Gomer's disappointed expression out of the corner of his eye as he wrestled with the transmission. He slid it toward the tailgate and took a deep breath. Though one person couldn't lift one by himself, moving a transmission was really a two-person job. One person risked dropping it. In one heave, Kyle lifted it, swung it a few feet over, and then lowered it into the cradles. He was relieved when the clang of metal on metal told him it was in place. He half expected Gomer to make a move on him, and Kyle was relieved when the other man just stood there. By the time he reached the garage door, he found himself relaxing and smiling at how quickly Gomer had almost baited him. Buddha would not be pleased, Kyle thought, and neither would Max. Before he pushed the rig inside, Kyle couldn't resist giving Gomer a wave and saying, "You have a nice day now." Smiling at Gomer's stunned expression, Kyle pushed the transmission into the garage. He used the hydraulic lift to raise the car about 2 feet. Then he got underneath to drop the old transmission. For a few minutes, everything melted away. He was doing something he knew he could do well, and he was the only one of the guys in their group who had found a job. Plus, there was something zen about auto repair. His first introduction to Buddhism had come from a copy of a book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance that he had found at football camp. At first, he thought it was a joke, but the book had turned out about to be serious. He read it cover to cover, and Kyle had never been much of a reader. Then he had gone to the library to get more books on Buddhism. The next thing he knew, he was trying to walk the middle path. It had been almost as big a change for him as learning the truth about the aliens in his town. Now he found the work relaxing him. His almost confrontation with Gomer was forgotten, as was the fact that less than 48 hours before he had left the only life he had ever known. His worries were replaced by the work his hands did, his mind both concentrating on the task and drifting. Kyle wasn't sure if that was his true Zen state, but it was good enough for him. Maria was glad to get out of Bell's, even though the morning had not been too bad. She and Liz had quickly settled into their old patterns. The time had passed quickly. On the other hand, they still had lunch and dinner to get through. In the past, she had sometimes pulled 12-hour shifts to crash down, but they were tough. She knew she would be dragging her feet for the last couple of hours. Sleeping in the van hadn't helped. She doubted she had gotten more than 4 hours of actual sleep, and she had woken up sore and aching. Tonight might be better if the guy from the garage let them use the room with the shower. Sleeping on a floor would be better than sleeping sitting up in the van. Passing through Main Street, Maria was struck by how empty the town looked. Then she caught sight of another missing person flyer. This one was new, or at least it was one that she hadn't seen before. The woman in the photo looked older than the other two, maybe in her early 30s. She was outdoors somewhere, and she was smiling broadly. Maria looked at the picture for a moment before she realized that she was walking the streets alone. Hadn't Belle warned them not to go outside unless they were together? Maria felt a chill run down her back and started walking quickly toward the garage, which was still more than 2 blocks away. More than 2 deserted blocks, Maria realized. Then there were a couple of 100 yards of open field. Suddenly, Maria was overcome with a strong feeling that she was being watched. It was a crawling sensation on the back of her neck. She tried to dismiss it as her mind playing tricks on her. Maybe she was spooked by the missing person posters or the emptiness of the streets, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Of course, she caught glimpses of people looking at her through windows, but those glances seemed mainly curious, benign. Still, she had the growing feeling that someone else was watching her, someone who meant her harm. Maria picked up the pace. By the time she reached the edge of the sidewalk, she was nearly trotting. When she reached the open field, she forgot about her pride and ran, barely keeping her grip on the plastic bags that held the takeout food. The few seconds it took her to reach the garage seemed too stretched to minutes, but finally she was there. She slowed to a walk when she was a few yards away from the garage. Almost immediately, she began to relax. By the time she reached the garage office, she already felt silly for worrying. Nevertheless, she decided to have Michael walk her back to the diner. Just as she was reaching for the door to the office, someone popped out from behind a pickup. Maria jumped. Then she saw it was a man, a large man. She almost screamed, and then she realized he looked familiar. Hey, he said. She started again at the sound of his voice. Then she realized who it was. Gomer, the guy who had towed their van. With an unpleasant grin on his face, he said, "You want to be careful. Watch out for them aliens." Maria's stomach leaped. Did he know? How could he? Hey, what? She gasped. The aliens, the ones that take the women. At least that's what they say. You shouldn't be out alone, he said. Maria felt her stomach start to work its way back down from her chest. I'll be careful, she said, pushing her way into the office. Inside, she saw a blonde girl behind a desk. The girl looked up and gave her a tight smile. She also looked Maria over carefully. Hi, Maria said. I'm looking for Kyle. Then the girl gave her a smile that Maria instantly didn't trust. Oh, he's in the garage. Are you his girlfriend? Maria was taken aback for a moment by the directness of the question. Oh, I'm a friend of his. I brought his lunch, she said, holding up one of the bags. Can I get in through there? She pointed to the door in the rear of the office. You sure can, the girl said through the same tight smile. Maria headed for the door. Okay then, bye, Maria said. Bye-bye, the girl trilled, and though Maria couldn't see her anymore, she was sure the girl was wearing the same smile as she said it. She came out into the large garage, scanning it for Kyle. Seeing the owner, Maria walked right over to him and pulled a food container out of the bag she carried. Hi, she said, holding out the styrofoam box. Meatloaf with gravy, no mushrooms. Belle said it was her usual. He looked at her confused for a moment. It's our way of saying thanks for the shower and oatmeal this morning, Maria said, handing him the food. The recognition bloomed on Dan's face, and then he did something Maria didn't expect. He smiled. Thank you, he said. Is Kyle around, she asked. The question was just out of her lips when Kyle appeared next to her. Hey, Kyle said. Lunchtime, Maria said. Why don't you take a break, Dan said, the ghost of the smile still on his lips. Kyle came with her around back. The guys weren't in the van, so they tried the room in the back. Before they entered, they heard laughter from inside. Opening the door, they found Michael, Max, and Isabel sitting on the floor, huddled around an ancient board game. You're going down, Michael said to Max. Maria leaned down and saw which game it was. Chutes and ladders. Perfect, she thought. And the three aliens looked up. Maria frowned and said, I'm glad that while we are mere mortals are busting our butts, you guys are making yourselves useful. Max and Michael started to get up. Maria? Max started. She shook her head. It's okay. Somebody should be having fun today. Lunch is served, she said, handing out the food. Can you stay and eat with us? Michael asked. You can get into the game if you want, he added. I have time to eat, Maria said, sitting on the side of the bed. She brought her something for herself anyway. Where's Liz? Max asked. She's back at the diner, brooding. I think she's been spending too much time with you, she said. Concern immediately ran over Max's features. She's fine, Maria said quickly. You guys should come out by for the dinner at the end of the rush, 6:30 or so. Then Maria took out her own food. She was glad to sit, even gladder to not have to go back outside alone to face the aliens or whatever it was that had the whole town and now her spooked. On the other hand, as Michael dug into his burger, she realized she had an alien of her own to protect her. Come on, space boy, you're walking me back, Maria said. Michael fought an urge to snap back at her for giving him an order. Okay, he said, standing up. Maria shot him a look of surprise, and that made the effort of holding his tongue worth it. Ready to go, he said, grinning at her. He enjoyed the slightly confused look on her face as she got up off the floor. Sure, she said. He nodded to Max and the others, and then he and Maria were out the door and headed for town. He noticed that she seemed nervous as they walked along the open field that separated the edge of Main Street from the garage. She looked over her shoulder at least 5 times as they crossed the short distance. You know, this is the first time we've been alone since we left, he said. What? She said, clearly distracted. I said, this is the first time. Michael, there's something strange going on in this town, she said, as if she hadn't spoken. Right here, in fact, Michael said, not even trying to keep the annoyance out of his voice. Michael, I'm serious. Haven't you seen those missing person posters in town? It's creepy. Well, we're not going to be staying long, Michael said. I ran into Gomer and he said something about aliens. The girls were abducted by. Here we go, he said, shaking his head. I know it sounds stupid, she said. That's because it is stupid, he said, raising his voice. He was angry now, more at himself than at Maria. He hadn't wanted to fight with her. As they drove in the van and the miles sped by, Michael had found the earliest stirring of peace on the road. He had hoped things would be different for him and Maria. As they drove farther away from Roswell and the pressure they had always been under, he felt sure things would be different. He would make them different. But why did she have to drive him so crazy? So you're saying I'm stupid, she said. By sheer force of will, he kept himself from saying any more. Then what? She started, her own face scrunched and angry. Stop, he said, raising one hand. Look, I'm sorry. That seemed to stop her cold. Michael saw that they were getting close to the diner. He didn't want to spend the few seconds they had fighting. What? She said. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that you're stupid. I'm just saying that the only aliens you're going to find in the town are the ones you brought with you. We need to be careful, but we left all that stuff behind you in Roswell. That was the point of this class trip, Michael said. Maria looked at him, thankfully silent for a moment. We've all seen the signs, he continued. There is something strange going on here, but it has nothing to do with us and nothing to do with aliens. My guess is that a bunch of girls got wise and escaped this hole in the wall without leaving a forwarding address. Maria started to speak, but he raised his hand and she was silent. If some psycho is kidnapping girls, I'll watch out for you. Just don't go outside alone, or better yet, unless I'm there. He paused for a moment and said, okay? Okay, she said, nodding. They were approaching the diner door when he stopped her with a hand. Don't worry, Michael said. He smiled and said, I don't want to fight with you. Then he did what he'd wanted to do since they left the garage. Actually, since they left Roswell. Michael leaned down and kissed her. Though surprised, Maria responded immediately. A few seconds later, he felt her hands on his chest. Then she was pushing him away, gently at first, then with force. What? He said. What are you doing? She asked. Well, I thought it was self-explanatory, Michael said. I guess not. What are you thinking? Maria said. Michael raised his hands in frustration. Well, I was thinking that I wanted to kiss you, but I've reconsidered, he said, feeling his face go flush as the hairs on the back of his neck began to stand up. With effort, he fought down the rising anger. Look, Michael, I'm just not ready for this. Too much has happened, and I just don't know what we are to each other anymore. I'm going to need some time here, she said, the challenge clear on her face and in her voice. A voice inside his head screamed, I stayed on this planet for you. I blew my one chance to go back to the place I came from, for you. But Michael just put his hands down and said, as calmly as he could, okay. She was silent for a moment, looking at him with a surprised expression. When she spoke, her voice was calm. Look, I'm just not sure what I want right now. There's a surprise, he muttered under his breath. What? She said. Nothing, but understand this. I know exactly what I want, and I will wait, if I have to, Michael said. She looked at him with the same surprised expression. Well, he was surprised at himself, but he did know what he wanted, and he was determined to break the cycle of stupid arguments that had kept them apart too many times in the past. I'll wait, he said. Then he pointed to the diner door. Maria, you better get back to work. We'll come by before your shift is up. Don't go outside until then. He took a moment to enjoy her stunned expression, then turned and headed back for the garage. Kyle found Dan in the office. I just have to check the seals and add the fluid, then I'll be done with the transmission, he said. What's next? Points and plugs on the Impala and check the brakes. They've been grinding. They'll need pads, but see if you can save the rotors. I have to stop in town. I'll be back in about an hour, Dan said. Kyle nodded. I'll be fine. I'll keep an eye on him for you, Dawn said, flashing Kyle a smile. Kyle could barely keep the goofy grin from his face. When did my luck start changing, he wondered. He nodded to Dawn on his way out and said, see you later. You know it, she said. As Kyle entered the garage, he was glad his back was to Dawn because he lost the battle with his goofy grin, which spread itself wide across his face. A few seconds later, he was back under the car, doing a quick inspection of the seals and the transmission. It took some effort for him to concentrate on his work, but he forced himself to do it. Hey, I want to talk to you, a voice said from above him. It took Kyle a moment to place the voice. He was immediately annoyed at the interruption because it ended the warm feeling that lingered from his encounter with Dawn. I'll be up in a few minutes, Kyle said. He would actually be less than that, but the last thing he wanted to do was to let Gomer think he would rush on his say-so. We'll talk now. You don't have to get up, Gomer said. I just wanted you to know that Dawn is my girl. Kyle shook his head. This was ridiculous. Funny, she didn't mention that, he replied. Well, I'm mentioning it, Gomer said. His voice was tight, as if he was trying to intimidate Kyle. Well, Kyle was not going to be intimidated by this bad-tempered tow truck driver who worked at a shop in the middle of nowhere. Nevertheless, Kyle was very conscious of the fact that while Gomer was standing on the shop floor, Kyle was flat on his back with less than a foot of clearance between himself and the car above him. Kyle knew guys at the garage who didn't like to work under cars, either out of claustrophobia or a vague fear about the safety of the hydraulic lift that held the car off the ground. Though he had never had that problem himself, Kyle suddenly understood it. He considered sliding out from under the car, but he didn't want to give his nervousness away and give Gomer the satisfaction of thinking he had shaken Kyle up. Keeping his voice casual, Kyle said, I think Dawn's big enough to decide what she wants for herself. Kyle heard Gomer make a sound like a grunt. When he spoke, he shouted, you got a smart mouth. You want to watch that. We don't much like smart guys around here. Then you must fit right in, Kyle shot back immediately. Gomer didn't reply, but Kyle heard footsteps and a click. Leaning his head up, he could see Gomer's legs were very close to where Kyle's legs were hanging out from beneath the car. Suddenly, Kyle didn't care whether or not Gomer thought he had gotten the better of him. Kyle didn't want to spend another second under this car with Gomer up there. Since Kyle was lying on a wheeled cart, he could roll out in a second or less if he rolled toward where Gomer was standing. He couldn't go the other way because the transmission lift and some of the other equipment were blocking his way.
He could try to angle himself and roll out next to the lift.
It would put the car between him and Gomer when he got clear, but that would take several extra seconds at least. He decided to just face Gomer. Reaching up, he grabbed the underside of the car and pulled, moving the cart himself toward Gomer. Then something came down on his leg. It took Kyle a moment to process the fact that it was Gomer's foot. Kyle's forward motion stopped. "Where are you going, smart guy?" Gomer said. Kyle felt his heart sink in his chest, but he was surprised by the strength in his voice when he said, "Let go, Gomer." Instead, Kyle felt more pressure on his right ankle. "What's wrong, smart guy? Scared?" Gomer said. "This isn't funny," Kyle said. Then Kyle heard a click, and he immediately knew that Gomer had his hand on the lever that controlled the hydraulic lift's up and down motion. "Yeah, I think it's pretty funny. You should be careful under there. I don't think these things are safe. If something happened, you might hurt your smart mouth," Gomer said. Then the car lurched down to 2 inches in a sudden motion. "Ah," Kyle said, forgetting completely about his dignity. Frantically, he tried to move in any direction, but Gomer kept up the pressure on his leg. Kyle tried to calculate how much clearance he would have between this car and the floor if it dropped to the ground. How much damage would the car do to him? Would Max be able to fix it? He decided he didn't want to find out. "Wait, let's talk about this," Kyle said. "I don't want to talk to you, smart guy," Gomer said. Then he laughed. The laugh was low and creepy. Kyle decided he didn't like it at all. Then Kyle heard another click.
Here we go, chapter 11. Michael heard the shouting from inside the garage. Maria's talk about the kidnappings or whatever was going on in this town had gotten under his skin more than he'd expected. On the other hand, that was true about a lot of things that Maria said and did. Much like smart guys, Michael heard from inside as he passed the entrance to the garage. The words didn't exactly make sense, but the tone was very clear. Somebody was pretty pissed off. Michael debated checking around the back to see if the others were all right, but he was confident that Max and Isabel could handle most of the trouble they could find in this town. Then he remembered that Kyle would be working inside the garage. It might pay to check in on him. Walking through the large door, he didn't see anyone inside at first. Then 3 cars down, he saw someone he recognized. Gomer was standing next to a car, shouting down, "At the tire? No, that wasn't right." Then someone spoke back to Gomer, but Michael couldn't make out the words. "What's wrong, smart guy?" Gomer said. Michael decided he didn't like the tone of Gomer's voice and started walking towards him. Where was Kyle? There was some more back and forth, and Michael thought he heard Kyle's voice. Then Gomer grabbed a lever, and the car seemed to shake in the air. Then he heard a scream. Sure that the scream was Kyle's, Michael started running. He saw that Gomer had his hand on a lever. And then he saw Kyle's legs sticking out, one of them kicking at Gomer. When Michael saw the car move downward, he realized instantly what was happening. When he acted, he did so immediately and without thinking. Reaching Gomer, he reached out with one hand, grabbed the larger man on the shoulder, pulled him back, and then shoved him hard. Michael heard Gomer grunt, then fall backward to the ground. He was dimly aware of the fact that Kyle was still under the car when Gomer went flying. A moment later, Gomer was sitting on his butt and looking up at Michael in surprise. That surprise lasted only an instant and was replaced with fury. Well, Michael knew how that felt. For someone so tall, Gomer moved quicker than Michael would have guessed. Gomer was on his feet in seconds and was lunging for Michael. Acting on instinct, Michael leaned to one side and grabbed for Gomer's shirt. The larger man hit Michael's hip, and Michael used Gomer's momentum to toss him back to the ground. This time, Gomer went down face first in an awkward dive. Again, he moved quickly and was soon lurching to his feet. Too stupid to stay down, Michael thought, as a red haze of anger descended on him, drowning out all other thoughts. A moment later, Gomer charged Michael again. This time, Michael met him straight on, launching one punch with each fist. His left hit Gomer low in the ribs, while his right, then his left hit Gomer squarely in the face. Gomer staggered back. A satisfied smile crossed Michael's lips, and he raised his hand almost unconsciously. He felt his powers coalescing, and he prepared to... "Michael," a voice said from next to him. Michael ignored the distraction. He was dealing with a threat. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. The voice shouted this time, "Michael!" Turning, Michael saw Kyle standing next to him. Then he saw Gomer looking at him, fear clearly on his face. "Don't hurt him," Kyle said. It took a moment for Kyle's words to penetrate Michael's red heat. Then he slowly put his hand back down. He was trying, Michael said, not taking his eyes off Gomer. I was just kidding around, Gomer said, raising his hands in a warding off gesture. Michael felt himself relax by small degrees, very small degrees. You think that was funny? Michael nearly shouted. Gomer shook his head. I was just trying to scare him, he said. Michael balled his right hand into a fist. It was not an act of anger. It was calculated, and by the look in Gomer's eyes, it had the desired effect. I'm sorry, Gomer said. Don't apologize to me, Michael said, gesturing to Kyle. I'm sorry, Kyle. I was out of line, Gomer said. Apology accepted, Kyle said. Michael noted that his friend was out of breath. Kyle must have been pretty scared. Michael felt his anger rising again and forced it back down. Get out of here, Michael said. Gomer immediately turned to go, but not before shooting Kyle a look that Michael didn't like. Don't even think about it, Michael said. Then he paused for effect. Remember, I'm everywhere. Okay, Gomer said, walking away. Then Michael turned to Kyle and said, Are you okay? You want Max to take a look at you? Kyle shook his head and said, I'm fine, just a little shaken up. That's an understatement, Michael thought, looking at Kyle's face. Maybe he was just trying to scare me, Kyle said. Then, catching Michael's questioning expression, he added, He thinks I'm after the girl in the office. Are you? Michael asked. Kyle smiled and said, Maybe a little. Michael shrugged and said, I don't think he'll bother you either way. Kyle gave him a tighter smile and said, I think you're right. Listen, Michael, were you going to... Michael shook his head and said, No, I was just kidding around, trying to scare him. That seemed to make Kyle relax. His smile was broader now. Michael, thanks. Sure, Michael said, giving him an uncomfortable shrug. I probably made it worse. It's not smart to bait someone when you're stuck under a car. I'm just tired of taking it, I feel like I've been taking it for long enough. Michael nodded. He knew how that felt. He, Max, and Isabel had been taking it their whole lives, and the group had been taking it pretty hard for the last 3 years. Yeah, I know what you mean, he said. I better go get back to work, Kyle said. Michael turned to go, and Kyle added, I mean it, Michael, thanks. No problem, Michael said, heading out the door. Outside, he decided not to go straight back to the others. Instead, he took a walk on the field behind the garage. Finding a quiet spot, he sat for a moment. He had told Kyle that he wasn't going to really hurt Gomer, but he wasn't sure himself what he was going to do. In the moment before Kyle stopped him, he felt the same rage he had felt in their final battle with Agent Pierce, a battle that ended when Michael killed the agent. Since then, Michael had told himself 1,000 times that he had no choice. His friends' lives and his own life had depended on him. And the truth was that he had acted in self-defense. Yet when he had taken the agent's life, he had not felt scared. He had felt angry, furious actually. And when it was done, there was a moment, just a moment, when he had felt pleased with what he had done. Pleased that he had finally paid back the forces that had been dogging him, Max and Isabel, their whole lives. Pleased that he finally felt that he had won a small victory for them and for himself. That moment had caused Michael more sleepless nights than the act of killing itself. He had also wondered how much of that moment had been payback for even more, for his previous life and his previous defeats and eventual death. And not just his death, but Max and Isabel's. He knew Michael blamed himself for that failure as well, but Michael knew that it had been his job to protect them after all. He was a soldier, a defender, a general, in fact. In his fight with Agent Pierce, with Gomer, and many other times in his life, he felt like something else was taking over. What was it? His training, his nature, or something that had been programmed into him when he had been recreated and sent to Earth? Michael didn't know, but whatever it was, Michael didn't like it, and it scared him more than 1,000 Agent Pierces ever would. Kyle's hand shook for several minutes after Michael left. He hoped Michael hadn't seen how scared he had been. At first, he had thought that Gomer was only trying to scare him. Although it was a possibility, the possibility dimmed when the undercarriage of the car had pressed against his nose and 3 tons of steel threatened to drop down farther. But Gomer had looked scared himself when he had left. Michael hadn't really hurt him, but he could have. In fact, he nearly did. Even Gomer wasn't so stupid to miss that. Kyle had to go back under the car to check the seal on the transmission. He forced himself to do it quickly because he couldn't afford to be afraid in his line of work. It took about 10 minutes, and Kyle was glad to be finished. He moved on to the Plymouth and replaced the points and plugs. He finished that quickly, then took both cars for a test drive. An hour later, he parked the second car outside. By then, his heart had stopped racing and he was feeling more or less normal, which was just as well considering what he now had to do. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the office door and stepped inside. Dawn flashed him her smile, and Kyle felt the last piece of cold fear melt away. "Hey, you," she said. Without thinking, Kyle felt himself smiling back. "Hey," he said. She stared at him for a moment, then Kyle remembered why he'd come inside. "Did Dan leave any instructions for me?" he asked. Just a note," she said. Though she held the note in her hand, she did not reach out to hand it to him. As a result, Kyle had to lean over the desk to take it. When his hand reached hers, she pulled the note back, and Kyle had to lean over farther. He lost his balance for a moment and started to fall into the desk. Reaching out with his other hand, he steadied himself and found that he was inches away from Dawn. He could even feel her blonde hair tickling his cheek. He felt her hand on his shoulder, and Kyle couldn't help taking a deep breath, taking in her scent. Wow, did she smell good. "Careful there, sugar," Dawn said, not taking her hand off the shoulder. Kyle got up slowly and returned her smile. Dawn held the note out in front of her again, a teasing smile on her lips. Just looking at her, Kyle knew immediately that she was trouble. Gomer was jealous and bad-tempered, and Kyle had a responsibility to his friends to make sure they all kept a low profile. Plus, even when he was a Roswell High School star athlete, he had never gone out of his way to seek out trouble off the field. That went double for the last 2 years when he had become part of the great alien secret society. Just like his friends, he had been adept at avoiding trouble. Just 2 days ago, he would have taken one look at Dawn and headed in the other direction, but that was 2 days ago. He had changed his life completely in that time. One of the reasons he and his friends had hit the road was so that they could stop hiding all the time. They had started running so they could relax a little. It gave them the best chance of a normal life, and there was nothing more normal than a little lighthearted fun with a pretty girl. Reaching out, he took Dawn's hand and held it for a long moment before taking the note. "Thanks," he said. "Anytime, sugar," she said. Chapter 12. When Michael walked in, Max jumped to his feet. "Where have you been?" he asked sharply, more sharply than he had intended. Michael didn't answer for a moment. Setting his face, he said, "Gee, Dad, I guess I should have called." "Michael, this is serious. People are disappearing right and left in this town, and you take off for hours?" Max chided. "Actually, women are disappearing in this town, so I think I'm pretty safe. Plus, newsflash, I can take care of myself," Michael said, holding up his hand. "You know, alien whammy and all that," he added. His friend was right, Max knew. He immediately regretted his tone. And if he knew Michael, things would get worse from here. Some combination of his friend's nature and the difficult childhood he'd spent with a violent drunk named Hank had conditioned Michael's response to disagreements. Max decided to stop the escalating conflict before it got going. "Michael, it's not that," he began, but his friend waved him off. "Forget it, Maxwell. I just went for a walk," Michael said. "Next time I'll give you a heads up." Michael had surprised Max a couple of times in the last 2 days, but this was the biggest surprise yet. There was something different about Michael, Max thought, considering his friend for a moment. Max saw something in Michael's face, but his friend quickly looked away, studying the changes in the room. Something was bothering Michael. Maybe he and Maria had had a fight. It would not be unusual. In fact, it would be par for the course. "What happened in here?" Michael asked, before Max could say anything. Michael surveyed the room and then said, "What did you guys do in here?" "Just freshen things up a bit," Isabel said. "It was a little depressing." Michael took in the changes. The walls, which had been battered and fitted sheetrock, were now smooth. Before, the original color had been anybody's guess because of the grime on the faded walls. Now the walls were blue and looked freshly painted. Isabel must have been using her powers. Looking around the room, Michael took in the rest of the changes. The shelf looked like it had been refinished. The hot plate looked like new, and so did the sink. The beanbag chairs looked new and were no longer held together with duct tape. Isabel had reattached the television's antenna and cleaned up the set as well. Michael shook his head. "Way to keep a low profile, guys," he said. Then he turned to Max and said, "You allowed this?" Max was uncomfortable, and it showed on his face. "Haven't you heard? Max is just a fellow traveler, Michael. He's not making all the rules here," Isabel said. Michael turned to her and said, "Why did this feel like your work?" "Oh, lighten up, Michael. We just did something nice for the guy who's letting us stay here," she said. "Very nice. And we can maybe explain the walls, but how are you going to explain you reconditioned the appliances?" he asked. Michael turned back to Max and said, "Well?" Max put up his hands and said, "I was against it." "Well, as long as you lodged a formal protest," Michael said. "Maybe I went too far on some of it, but we can always change it back before we go," Isabel said. Michael shrugged and sat down on the floor. He looked at Max and said, I just want to point out how screwy things have gotten if I am the voice of reason around here. Shaking his head, Michael asked, so much for democracy. How long before dinner? Isabel looked up at the wall, which held a clock with a picture of a cowboy on its face. When they arrived, the clock had been worn and broken. Now it kept perfect time and looked new. Max knew Michael was right. They had to be more careful. Just under an hour and a half, Isabel said. What's the game? Michael asked. Fizbin, Max replied. Fizz what? Michael said. We'll explain as we play, Isabel said as she dealt out the cards. Liz put her last dinner order down in front of the last two of the latecomers. The locals all ate early, Bella explained, but the people who commuted to Pueblo came in later. From what Liz saw, a lot of people commuted to Pueblo. There didn't seem to be much work in this town. She also noted that there wasn't a single woman or girl who came in alone. They just didn't wander around by themselves in Stonewall, and now Liz knew that it was for a good reason. Someone was preying on the woman in town. For a moment, she felt a flash of shame for letting Maria walk to the garage by herself. Liz had been shaken by her vision of Jimmy's future and had been too absorbed in her own thoughts to even think about the danger to Maria. She had felt better when she called Johnny's, and the girl who'd answered had said that Maria had arrived fine. Liz had felt even better when Maria had come back with Michael in tow. Maria came in with a frown on her face, and one look at Michael's face told Liz why. Another fight, Liz had asked. But Maria hadn't wanted to talk about it, and soon enough the dinner rush started. Jimmy had watched Liz throughout the rest of the shift and had not said anything to her. Liz was glad for that, then ashamed of herself. She was ashamed that she had avoided looking at him, but she didn't want to see what was in his eyes. She could feel the pain well enough without seeing it. And she didn't want to see what was in hers. One of the reasons she had left with Max was so that they could be together and find some semblance of peace, so they could live together without fear and without shame. But that was not the only reason. They had also wanted to stop living only for themselves, living only to protect their precious secret. The secret of the alienness that had lived inside of Max, Michael, and Isabel, and now lives inside Liz and would probably one day take up residence in Kyle as well. They had left Roswell so they could use their secret and their powers to help other people, like Tom Joad and the Grapes of Wrath. Liz herself had said, doing good deeds and avoiding the law, and she had believed in that idea. And 2 days later, she was avoiding the gaze of a boy whom she could not help. Can't or won't, a voice in Liz's head said. Shame. There was danger here. Liz could feel it. She had sensed it very clearly when she had had her vision of Jimmy at his sister's funeral. She had sensed it very strongly when she had seen the room that was not quite a room, and she had heard it in the girl's screams, a lost, terrified sound that she knew would visit her in her dreams for some time. Whatever Jessica was going to kill her, and he was very dangerous. No, not he, Liz thought. It's a they. She didn't know how she knew that, but something in the vision told her that it was a they, a very dangerous they. Liz forced herself to look at Jimmy. He was clearing the last empty table. As if he felt his eyes on her, he turned to return her look a few seconds later. He smiled at her. It was a grim smile that didn't belong on his innocent face. Liz smiled back, then she felt something move inside her. She had been afraid to look at Jimmy before, but she had done it. There was something else Liz was afraid of, very afraid, and it wasn't whoever had Jimmy's sister and the other missing girls in this town. It was shame. She couldn't face it, and then she knew she didn't have to. Almost immediately, the clouds started lifting. She walked over to Jimmy and put a hand on his shoulder. Though she was relieved when no visions came, she knew she would face them when they did come, without fear. Liz knew she had made the right decision. Come on, Parker, we've got side work to do, Maria said. Max saw Liz through the window. He felt a moment of relief when he saw that she was there. He knew his worries were probably baseless. She could be safe inside a crowded diner. He was sure of it, yet he was still relieved to see her. As soon as he did see her, though, he realized that something was wrong. Something was bothering her. Almost as soon as he realized that, she was heading for the door. She was there as he stepped inside. Hi, she said, her voice even. Max leaned down to kiss her and said hi. He couldn't ask her what it was now. That conversation would have to wait until they were alone. You guys can sit over here, Liz said, pointing to a long table near the center of the empty diner. A woman Max recognized from yesterday came out from the kitchen. A smile appeared on her face, and she said, Girls, are these your friends? Liz and Maria nodded together. Well, sit down, the woman said, just turning to the table. I'm Belle, she added when they had all sat. Liz stepped forward and said, This is Max, Isabel, Michael, and Kyle, pointing to each one as she spoke their name. Pleased to meet you, Belle said. Then she turned to Liz and Maria and said, You sit down too. Liz started to protest, but Belle shushed her with a wave. Looking at Max, Belle said, they had been on their feet for nearly 12 hours straight. Best help we've had here. As Liz and Maria sat, Belle also got a pad. Now, what can I get you kids? After she had taken their order, Belle disappeared into the kitchen. The door shut behind her and drowned out any sounds from the kitchen. Once Liz was sitting, Max could see that she was tired. Maria, too. They had been working a double shift. Max felt a pang. He had done nothing to help their cause, while Liz and Maria had worked 12 hours in a row. Kyle, too. I'm some leader, he thought. Then he noticed that Liz kept glancing at the boy from yesterday, the one with Down syndrome. He was sitting in the booth next to the window, staring out and down the street. Do you want to invite him to sit with us? Max asked Liz. She shook her head. I already did. Belle says that he likes to sit by himself at the end of the day and look for his sister. How long has she been gone? Max asked. Almost a week, Liz said. There was something in her voice and face that told Max there was something else, something she wasn't telling him. Instead, she turned to Kyle and asked, so how was work at Johnny's? Kyle and Michael told the girls the same story Max had heard on the walk over. So Gomer is dangerous? Maria asked when they were finished. Kyle shrugged and said, since Michael had a talk with him, I think he's mostly in danger of wetting himself. Though Kyle smiled when he said that, Max could see that their friend had been shaken up by his experience. So you did do something worthwhile today, Michael, Maria said. Michael shrugged at that, and Max could see that he was uncomfortable. It looked like everyone was on edge today. Max was surprised. Stonewall hadn't looked like much of a town. The fact was, it still didn't look like much, but it was definitely dangerous. Women were missing. Crazed tow truck drivers were thrown into fits of jealous rage. Something was going on here. Up until now, Max had thought the biggest danger they faced in Stonewall was being out of money. Max decided that he, Michael, and Isabel would have to keep an eye on the others. It looked like there was something for him to do here. A few minutes after Belle had brought their food out, she and Sam emerged from the kitchen with plates for themselves. Liz and Maria immediately rose and started moving another table to add to theirs so that everyone would be able to sit together. Pointing to the now larger table, Liz said, join us. She didn't have to look to know that Max was giving her a look, probably Michael too, but there were things she needed to know, things that were more important than avoiding other people to keep their secret. You sure you want a couple of old farts intruding? Belle asked. Don't be silly, just sit, Liz said. Belle nodded and said, kids, this is my husband, Sam. Sam, these are Liz and Maria's friends. Sam gave them a short nod as the older couple sat down to eat. So what are you kids doing on the road in that van of yours? Belle asked. For a second, no one spoke, and Liz glanced at Max. She saw that the others were doing the same. Max didn't hesitate further. We all just graduated from high school. We wanted to see the country and to stay together for a while, he said. Liz was relieved. It was a good story. It was also true, as far as it went. Belle turned to Sam and said, we should have done something like that when we were kids. Sam gave a snort but didn't look up from his food. Turning to the group, she smiled and said, Sam is not the adventurous type, but I'm glad to see you kids doing what you want. You'll have plenty of time later to settle down into jobs and a normal life. Will we? Liz wondered. Will we ever? She watched as Belle reached her fork onto Sam's plate and ate something from it. There was something very familiar and warm about the gesture. Liz was sure that the two did have something together. Something good, something normal, something that was impossible for the six of them now, something that was impossible for her, even if she did somehow sever her connection to her half-alien boyfriend. Could she find a normal life for herself? In the last 3 years, she had spent countless hours hoping for that normality, but she had been changed by her experience. Even if she could somehow forget everything that had happened in the last 3 years, she was no longer the girl she once was. In fact, she was no longer completely human. She was no longer normal. When the changes in her body first showed themselves, she had been scared. Now with her new abilities even more pronounced, she was still scared, but there was something else. She was determined not to let fear rule her life, determined that she would do something other than suffer as Max's codependent girlfriend, as she had once said to Maria. She was going to do something to make a difference with a new part of herself, and she was going to start right now. Belle, what do you think is going on with the disappearances? Liz asked. Liz watched a cloud cross Belle's face. She didn't speak for a long moment and then said, I really don't know. Then she paused again and said, there had been about a dozen in the last 3 months. About? Liz asked. Doesn't anybody know exactly how many? Well, people don't need a reason to leave this town, a hole in the wall with a few jobs left anymore, and a lot of people have taken off in the middle of the night over the years. Sometimes they're in trouble running from the law or their beau. Sometimes they're looking for something that they won't find in Stonewall, and sometimes they don't leave the forwarding address. So some are missing and some are escapees? Maria asked. Belle gave them a thin smile and said, probably. That didn't explain all of it, though, Liz knew, and it definitely didn't explain her vision of Jimmy's future. In the last 3 months, how many of the people who have left town have been guys? Liz asked. None, Belle admitted. What do the police say? Max asked. Liz could sense that Max didn't approve of her interest in the town's strange business, but she was glad that he was helping. There was silence in Belle for a moment, and then she said, the sheriff was one of the first ones gone. She disappeared, and no one has heard from her since. A chill ran down Liz's spine as she remembered the room that wasn't a room and the screams. She was suddenly sure that no one would be hearing from the sheriff ever again. The state police don't believe what they're hearing. They think the girls just ran off, Belle said. Jimmy said that a few girls turned up later, Liz said. Belle nodded. 3 more that we thought were missing turned up 5 days later. They were pretty shook up and didn't remember anything about where they had been. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with any of them. Liz didn't want to ask her the next question, but she couldn't back down now. How long has Jimmy's sister been gone? She asked anxiously. 7 days today, Belle said. The entire table was silent. To Liz's surprise, it was Sam who broke the silence. She was a nice girl, he said, and then went back to his food. Belle nodded. Actually, she had some wild years, but she always took care of Jimmy. Their parents died when they were young, and they were living with an aunt who doesn't much care about either of them. Jimmy still lives there. Jimmy said she was planning to move to Pueblo with him, Liz said. Belle nodded. Yes, she had gotten into a hairdressing school. They were supposed to leave in a few weeks. The table went silent for the rest of the meal. Liz found she wasn't hungry and forced herself to eat. As she did, she found the new things inside her asserting itself more strongly, pushing aside the fear that she had felt for so long. She realized that she knew that new thing's name. It was determination.